Almost, we just look at the opening slide here. I mean, we've kept the Act Now, EEXI and CII theme at the forefront here. We're going to follow on from that, and we're going to stress the importance of, getting everything prepared for this as much as possible. And that's something that Georgios and perhaps David might go into throughout their part of the presentation. The speakers for this event, I'll not introduce everybody. I'll let everybody to introduce themselves as they go throughout the event. My name is Mark Smith, Loss Prevention Executive, previously Technical and Fleet Superintendent with a container carrier company, and then working in the Loss Prevention Department in the Decarbonisation Working Group, dealing with loss prevention matters and also to do with fuel-related issues and guidance. I leave everybody else in the panel to introduce themselves as we go throughout the presentation, and we'll get going in a minute because I think we're up on the time now. People are gradually coming in as and when, but if they miss the start of it, then they can always look at the recording, and we'll take it from there. So first and foremost, COP26. November's been a busy month, really, with respect to shipping, climate change, whichever way you want to look at it. There's been a lot happened, and there's a lot more about to happen. We'll look into the COP26 and what impact that had on shipping and how that had a bearing on MEPC 77. Perhaps not as much as we'd expected, but it did have an impact on it. So that brings us on to the next slide. We look at the different elements that COP26 influenced on shipping. Biofouling is one of the first points here. We always say, especially when we go into the carbon intensity indicator, when we look at that, biofouling is going to be quite an easy win for ship owners. Keep your ship hull clean, and then you're going to consume less fuel, and that's going to have a positive impact on your CII rating and your CO2 emissions. And the analogy I sometimes like to use when I'm explaining biofouling is a bit like, driving a car with flat tires, you're going to burn extra fuel. A ship with a fouled hull is going to burn extra fuel. However, it's harder to control as a ship owner than it is with a car tire where you've got full control, because a ship owner may be subject to charterers' orders and long periods and warm climates, stationary vessel, etc., etc. So it's a little out of control there to a certain extent, but it's something that needs to be monitored by the ship owners to prevent and lower CO2 emissions. Nuclear alternatives, and one of the questions we had as people registered for this webinar was, was there a big push for nuclear in COP26? And there most certainly was. And nuclear is a very big and deep subject that we don't have time to go into now, but we've got an article we've launched on this on the Napier website. If you can't find the article, please come and contact us. But that talks about the potential use of molten salt reactors and the use of them on merchant ships, and how that may be something we see in the near future, depending on the barriers in place. The roadmap for green hydrogen, something else that we're going to see at the moment. The fossil fuel produced hydrogen is lower in cost than green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is of course produced by renewable energy, but we expect to see that transition within the next decade, and renewable energy creating green hydrogen coming a lot lower into the cost mix. The Getting to Zero Coalition, obviously that featured, that received plenty of attention at COP26, and that yet again is another push towards zero carbon shipping. Green shipping corridors was something that was announced, and that's something which is, there's a number of signatories in the Clydebank Declaration, and Georgios may touch on this throughout his presentation, but that's zero emission maritime routes between ports on a voluntary basis, and the subsequent infrastructure and the chain that surround that to support that. The Glasgow Declaration was out the demands of more than 50 climate vulnerable nations, including Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America, the Middle East, and the Pacific. And the phasing out of coal is something which will have an impact on shipping, because ship owners and charterers who have recently and for long periods been involved with the transportation of coal on a global basis, they're going to be impacted by this, and they're going to look for other cargoes to ship. The Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance really goes without saying what that's looking to do. It's looking to further research in this area and progress past the oil and gas side of the industry. And then the Global Methane Pledge is something where they're trying to lower methane slip. Now, there has been calls from the industry to look at this in a more stringent manner and to reduce methane slip on a 100-year life cycle global warming potential basis. But this was not taken up. It was on a shorter basis. But it's still, what we say is it's still having some effect, and it's still engine makers and bunker suppliers are looking at ways to reduce methane slip. So MEPC 77, just moving on to that, one of the reasons we're here today is to discuss this, and we just want to go through the different points briefly and what's changed and what wasn't really changed. So the first thing, and perhaps one of the most important points, is the life cycle analysis here. And that really didn't get as much traction and didn't move as long as we would like to have hoped to. We're going to talk about that in another slide later on, but we would have liked to have seen a little bit more movement there because we think it's definitely a positive move and it's something that's needed within the industry. The next point we want to bring to the attention is, revised proposals for the Imrb fund. This is essential. Research and development. This is a $5 billion fund, and it's being decided what's happening. But we think this is essential so that the whole industry can develop and collaborate and use the technology effectively to move forward. And then the midterm measures, we haven't really seen the movements we wanted to there, but this has been pushed forward to another working group, an intersessional working group, and we may see different targets towards zero carbon and, possibly a mid-step at 2040. Who knows? There's a lot to be decided there. Then looking at the short-term measures, we're going to be looking at the development of the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Program, which is the SEMP, and that's going to be potentially adopted at MEPC 78, which will be middle of 2022. The development of draft guidelines on correction factors for certain ship types and operational profiles will also be under development, and that's something that's a work in progress at the moment. We'll touch on these points in the next couple of slides, just to give you an overview, a very brief overview. So we spoke about life cycle analysis, and really the well to wake is something you'll hear. But for those of you that are not too familiar with a well to wake, it's looking at everything basically from the oil well right until the propeller propels the ship through the water. And here we've used a schematic to try and describe this and explain it as accurately as possible to you, just to get the message across to those of you that haven't got experience with this. So at the moment, when we're looking at fuels, we're effectively looking at this part of the process. This is what we're looking at. We're looking at the tank to wake. So when it's from the tank on board the vessel till when the vessel produces a wake by propelling itself through the water with propulsion. But as we can see, this is a very small part of the process. And if we use, for example, hydrogen as an example, hydrogen, there's no carbon atoms, and therefore it's zero carbon fuel potentially. But if the production process does not use renewable energy sources and it uses, for example, fossil fuels, then really the whole process isn't as zero carbon or as decarbonization friendly as it should be. So what the well to wake process effectively is looking at is right the way from the start here, all the way through the process, right the way until the ship produces the wake. And that's very important because we need to understand all of these factors in the middle here, what bearing they're having on the fuel itself. As we can see in this example, we've got renewable energy. So we've got hydroelectric power, we've got wind power, and we've got solar as well. And all of this is being used to facilitate this production. But if you replaced all of this renewable energy with fossil fuels, then obviously it's going to be less environmentally friendly and it's going to create more CO2 emissions. So that really is how the well to wake works. The other point we looked at is the Ship energy efficiency management plan. And as we said, more is going to be decided on that, and that's going to become clearer in MEPC 78. But the process will be, it will be rounding about what this is. So effectively, you start off with your planning, you're implementing, then you need to monitor, and then you evaluate and improve. So it's a constant cycle where ship owners will basically go through this process to constantly improve. And that really is the term we want to use here and bring to the forefront. It's about constant improvement. The EEXI, the Energy Efficiency Existing Ship Index, will be a one-off change in 2023. But as we'll see in the next slide, the CII, the Carbon Intensity Indicator, is going to change throughout time. So this just brings us on to this. This is a slide we've used before, and it's quite a basic description of what's happening. The carbon intensity indicator is not too dissimilar in some ways to a domestic appliance that has an efficiency rating effectively. A is the rating you're aiming for, and E is the E inferior rating. And port authorities and stakeholders are obviously going to encourage ship owners which can get towards the A rating. Now, the stepped approach that's been taken in this reduction process means that from 2023, there's a gradual reduction, and it increases by 2% up until 2026, and then more is to be decided after 2026. So that's that part of the process, and then we look onto the next part of the process, which is the part of the process we want to bring to the forefront here is the carbon intensity indicator. And without going into the details of the formula, the formula involves fuel consumption and distance traveled. Now, without going into the details of this, what this then means, for example, is if you've got, for example, a tanker which doesn't travel much distance at some periods when it's discharging oil-related cargoes, and it has to heat the cargoes up, it means the vessel is just burning a lot of fuel while the vessel's still stationary. So therefore, the distance travel is reduced. And that's why certain type of vessels are impacted more by the CII rating than others. And that's why we'll potentially see in the future, we'll see correction factors coming to the forefront to allow these different vessel types to be monitored accordingly. Now, we spoke before about the MEPC 77 perhaps not progressing as much as we would have hoped. That's open to debate. But the one thing we will say, and I think Georgios is probably going to bring it across in the part of the presentation ABS is giving, is that it's almost pushing ship owners into a bit of a corner here, because MEPC 78 isn't going to be decided by mid 2022. And then by the time 2023, it's just around the corner effectively. So what we've got to try and help our members, that's what we're trying to do here, is guide our members. We've got a website, Navigating Decarbonisation, and that goes through the various aspects of decarbonisation, the various topics, the various methods ship owners can use to try and reach the targets. So please feel free to look at the website. Please feel free to ask us the questions. Any questions we're more than happy to ask. At this point now, I'm going to hand over to Georgios, and then Georgios is going to go through the ABS, the classification society part of the presentation, and some of the technical angles. And then Helen will then look at it from the contractual side, and then we'll form a question and answer session after that. Thank you very much, and over to you now, Georgios, for the next part of the presentation. If you could just take control now, please, Georgios. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Mark. Let me try to take control. I think I have control now.
Yes, you do.
Let me change gears with the ABS presentation. Hello, everybody. I'm Yorgos Plevrakis, Director of Global Sustainability for ABS. I have the responsibility of the sustainability strategy and the sustainability team that is active in the American Bureau of Shipping, providing decarbonization and ESG insights and related services to the industry. Now, jumping straight into the main part of the presentation, we tend to start these presentations by looking into what are the elements of the emerging landscape, as we call it. We have ahead of us an emerging landscape of decarbonization requirements unraveling. And we present a view to the next decade, but the decisions that one has to take today will actually have an impact beyond the current decade, as ships have a lifespan above, of course, as we all know, 10 years, well into the next 2 decades. So what do we have as far as this emerging landscape of decarbonization requirements is concerned? What do we have ahead of us? First of all, as Mark has already highlighted, we have what the global regulator will bring in place by 2023 already. We will have the entry into force of the EEXI regulation, the technical filter with which all existing vessels will have to pass through which all existing vessels will have to pass through, and they will have to comply with a certain design index based on reduction factors compared to 2010, 2013 design index references. As soon as these vessels go through the EEXI filter, they will have to climb down the decarbonization trajectory set by IMO, the carbon intensity indicator that also we heard a few words by Mark earlier, and the fact that it will have a rating mechanism. This will take us to 2030, where the envisioned reduction in carbon intensity will be achieved, and that will be 40% and get against 2008 levels. But this is not the only decarbonization trajectory that shipping assets will have to comply with or follow or align with. There are also regional requirements. We mentioned there the Fit for 55 coming from the European Union, and we will say a few words about that and present a few case studies. But also, there are market initiatives in the form of financier initiatives like Poseidon Principles, charterers initiatives in the form of sea cargo charters. These also create the elements of decarbonization trajectories taking us to the end of the decade. And in the middle of the decade, in 2026, IMO will also revise its strategy based on the impact that the measures that will have already been applied had on ships and whether they were aligned with the envisioned trajectory for 2030 and beyond. So we are at the beginning of a very exciting decade as far as decarbonization is concerned. And we will start with what happened during COP26. Mark provided an overview. What we have here is a deeper dive on the elements that have a very close relation to shipping assets and the expected impact that COP26 decisions will have on them. A few days before COP26, we had the Cargo Owner Zero Emission Vessel initiative, which aims to lead the transition by decarbonizing the maritime freight that these cargo owners are using by 2040. What they have in place is an agreement to use only zero carbon fuels, vessels that use zero carbon fuels by that particular year. The reader of the signatory pledge would actually notice that the zero carbon fuel has some fine letters at the bottom of the text, giving a definition of what zero carbon fuels related to how the cargo owners initiative define it is. And with zero carbon fuels, they define fuels that have zero greenhouse gas emissions on a life cycle basis. So to Mark's point before, they are looking at the zero carbon perspective of fuels, taking a life cycle approach, looking at how these fuels are produced until how these fuels are actually, what is the footprint of these fuels from a combustion perspective. So throughout the value chain, throughout the life cycle of the fuels, they they will only consider solutions that are zero carbon. The Clydebank Declaration created those green corridors that we have all heard of. And it was signed during the COP26 with 22 signatories, countries that pledged an alignment, agreed on having and facilitating the establishment of partnerships that will actually encourage and incentivize trade between ports in those countries that have low and zero carbon footprint. There are already countries that are starting that with bilateral agreements in the Pacific region, where you're going to have ports that are connected through this type of green corridors, and they will incentivize more or less the use of low and carbon neutral fuels on these corridors as this declaration is materialized. Last but not least, the Methane Pledge. This started as an initiative from the European Union and the United States, and now during COP26, we saw 100 signatories signing up for that pledge. What it actually says is that these countries would put efforts in reducing methane emissions, fugitive methane emissions, not just methane slip, not the methane emissions that we have on board when we use methane LNG, for example, as fuel, but also the emissions that are related to the use, production, and production of methane natural gas, that is, throughout its life cycle, from upstream, midstream, downstream, the whole chain. The goal is to reduce these fugitive emissions by at least 30% compared to 2008 until 2030. And it also highlights what the bigger emitters are in this value chain by looking at the different aspects of the industries that are part of that chain, looking at agricultural emissions, at industrial emissions, all the way to transportation emissions. So it's not just about shipping, but it is impacting shipping in the sense that it will ask the methane emissions to be reduced across the value chain. What happens now from the global regulatory side with initiatives that are now being discussed in IMO? And we had, as Mark mentioned last week, the MEPC 77. We were expecting this week to be in front of you with more substantial news. Unfortunately, MEPC 77 was concluded with no major breakthroughs, particularly on the short-term measure clarifications that everybody was expecting. So the discussions in IMO right now, in the intersessional working groups and in the correspondence groups that are working on these measures, are around the implementation, the calculations, the exclusions, and the correction factors that should be in place for the application of the short-term measures, mainly the EXI and CII. There were also discussions about the inclusion of methane emissions and volatile organic compounds in the context of these measures, and this has been pushed forward for discussion in the next MEPC, MEPC 78. At least the proposals as texts and as the basis for discussion that were created during the intersessional working groups that were taking place before MEPC were approved during this MEPC. However, there was no conclusion and no resolution as far as this approach is concerned. Same with the midterm measures. The expectation was that we would be discussing more or less how market-based measures are going to be applied so that the transition can be supported in the midterm. This has also been postponed as far as the resolution and agreement for the next MEPCs. So, in a nutshell, what the previous intersessional working groups were discussing was that, first of all, during the round 9 of the Greenhouse Gas Intersessional Working Group, we had the discussion of the development of the life cycle guidelines, more or less proposals coming from different administrations, in order to create a framework to address that life cycle carbon footprint that we discussed earlier. That I made a couple of notes, and also Mark highlighted in his presentation the importance of having that framework so that we can assess the life cycle carbon footprint of the different fuel solutions that are suggested as solutions for the industry. The texts that were submitted by the intersessional working groups, therefore the proposals have been approved. The discussion will take place in the next MEPC. Also, as far as the market-based measures, that these include the carbon levy, low carbon fuel standard, cap and trade mechanism like the one that we have on the EU side. This was discussed during the intersessional working group around 10. But again, this was no resolution, no agreement took place in the MEPC that just finished last week. One final element that emerged during the last intersessional working group was the request for member states to review the goals. In other words, to revise the strategy based on what the COP26 would actually bring forth. And that actually happened. In MEPC we spent a big part of the week discussing the level of ambition that will take us to 2050, and in effect that would also have an impact on the decarbonization trajectories that we'll put in place, and vessels will have to align themselves with that. So the proposal was that we would have an alignment from the IMO side as well to look at zero greenhouse gas emissions, carbon neutral by 2050. There was a proposal, but no consensus on that was achieved. There was no consensus on the draft report. At this point in time, the committee did not support the draft resolution. This agenda has been pushed forward for the next MEPCs. We are going to have a discussion in MEPC 78 next year around the middle of the year. Having said that, unfortunately, this will not give us, as Mark also highlighted, if all these clarifications are pushed forward for the next MEPC, this will not give the industry enough time to get fully prepared for the introduction of these regulations. I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation that we have the entry into force of the EXI and CII regulation in 2023. When we say entry into force, we mean that the EXI will be entering into force, and vessels will have to comply on the first annual, intermediate, or renewal survey, whichever comes first in that particular year. And therefore, if we need to take some action, taking into consideration the clarifications that will be provided during the next 6 months, we are going to have little time to enforce and apply those actions that will have to apply. Taking into consideration what we have now in place already, regardless of the fact that some clarifications, as I mentioned, need to be provided, what we have is the EXI and EPL calculation now has two approaches. We can explore two options, the non-overrideable approach and the overrideable approach. Depending on the approach, the EPL that should be applied will become harsher or softer. If we go for the overridable approach, then one should expect an engine power limitation around 8% on a higher level on average. The CII will come into phases. The first phase has already started more or less, and this is just a conceptual approach where we start from 2020 implementing 1% reduction factor until 2023. After 2023, we're going to have the second phase with a 2% reduction factor, and in 2026, that is where the MEPC that is going to take place in that year will actually review the impact of these particular regulations, these particular measures had on the strategy, and will define how the reduction factors, what the reduction factors will be until the end of the decade. Now, all this is more or less now it's forming. Some aspects of that are well understood. It is very useful to look at the expected impact these regulations will have on the global fleet. And what we see is that, particularly on the EXI, the majority of vessels will have to do some corrective action in order to be compliant with EXI. We see almost 9 out of 10 bulk carriers, same with container ships, 85% of tankers, 95% of gas carriers. Gas carriers includes both LNG and other gas carriers. They will have to explore improvement options to comply with the EXI. In the majority of the cases, however, the EXI will be the EXI compliance will be achieved by the application of an engine power limitation. As far as the CII is concerned, again, the majority of the global fleet will have to do some sort of an improvement from an operational perspective now in order to achieve a rating below C. And we see similar percentages forecasting what the parts of the different segments will have to do some improvement options in order to remain below the required C rating based on the CII regulation. We have been very frequently asked to conduct studies, benchmarking studies, looking at the global fleet and identifying what the impact of these regulations will be on specific segments. And here's a study that we did on the tanker segment, and it actually shows that as far as VLCCs are concerned, the compliance with EXI will be a bit easier. However, a very interesting point emerged when we were looking at the EPL levels of the different segments. And here you see that older tonnage, particularly tonnage in the Aframax and LR categories that are older than 9 to 10 years old, will actually have to apply a lower EPL than the ones that are 4 to 10 years old. The reason there is because we had some changes on the tier 2, and therefore the specific fuel oil consumption changed over these years. A quick overview of the different segments as far as CII is concerned. What you see here is that on the bulk carriers, we see an increase in efficiency after the introduction of EEDI. However, before EEDI, so before 2013, there are years, contractual years, where vessels, based on 2020 data sets, vessels are performing better than others. We also see that on the container vessel segment. The container vessel segment will be more challenged with CII. That's why the application of some exclusions that are related to particularities with the operations of these vessels are necessary so that we can have a level playing field. Again, with tankers, we see an increase in operational efficiency, depending on against the contractual year, as you see on this slide. And we also see that pre-EEDI vessels, we see years that are, as far as their operational performance is concerned, are better than others. On the Fit for 55, so this is what happens on the European side. We see a number of regulations that are now being introduced. Fit for 55 is a package of regulations. We highlight here the four that are more closely related to shipping and will have a bigger impact on shipping. We see the introduction of the EU emission trading system, which is actually is introduced in order to incentivize operational efficiency, more or less. The introduction of the Fuel EU for maritime applications, which will drive the idea is that it will drive the introduction of carbon neutral fuels because it has the concept of life cycle within the regulation. The Energy Taxation Directive, which complements the other two and applies a tax on the bunkering side, a fuel levy. And last but not least, the deployment of alternative fuels infrastructure, which looks at how ports will actually, what ports have to do in order to support the transition. Mainly, the main topic here is how ports, major ports in the European continent will be able to provide shore connection as a requirement by 2030. Now, if we look at the actual vessel and which ones are going to have a direct impact, we will discuss about EU ETS and Fuel EU. Looking at the specific requirements with the EU ETS, there is, of course, the responsible entity. The responsible entity, so far as it is defined in the regulation, is the responsible for the operation of the ship under the ISM code. The geographic scope is more or less what the EU MRV is currently covering. Rule of thumb is 50% of the MRV voyage. It's going to come into phases. Will be shipping is going to be phased into the ETS from 2023, where we're going to have 20% of verified emissions having to be submitted as allocations, as allowances of, to the European Union. That will be 45% in the second year, 70% in the third, and in 2026 we're going to have 100% of the verified emissions submitted as allowances to the European Union. After 2026, the European Union will examine how shipping will actually enter completely into the trading system, and then hence the trading will actually commence officially. There are going to be penalties for non-complying, and if an entity and a vessel fails to comply for 2 consecutive years with the regulation, then it will not be able to visit the European port. It will be blacklisted, more or less. On the Fuel EU, we are going to have a required greenhouse gas intensity value for each individual vessel, and that is going to be compared against the calculated one every year. The required value will be reduced on an annual basis starting from 2025 until 2050 with a 2%, 6%, 13, 26, 59, and 75% until we reach the 2050. A very crucial point that needs to be highlighted here is the fact that this is the first regulation that introduces the life cycle approach. Well, we have 2 elements there, well to tank and tank to wake component when we calculate the greenhouse gas intensity. And there is no coincidence here that this methodology has also been introduced by the European Union to the IMO, and part of the discussions now that we're going to have in the next MEPC about the life cycle approach in IMO are proposals that come from the European Union based on on the work that has been done for the Fuel EU. Reaching at the end of this presentation, I will give you a couple of case studies that we conducted showing the impact of selecting one option of fuels against the other when it comes to CII and the European regulations. Now, as you see here, we have an example of a Kamsarmax bulk carrier that is it's going to be rated A at the beginning of this regulatory initiative, the CII initiative. But if it is running on conventional fuel, then by 2035 it will have to improve. It will have to explore improvement options from the operational side in order to continue and meet the required CII. If that was actually using LNG as fuel, then it could go straight to 2044. Or if it was using methanol, it could go straight to 2040. Keep in mind that the CII regulation considers at this point in time only tank to wake, and it is informed by the carbon factors that we have for the IMO DCS regulation. What happens now on the EU side? Well, this particular vessel, let's take the example of 2026, it will have to apply, it will have to surrender more or less allowances to the European Union that will range up to hundreds of euros if it was running on conventional fuel. The impact would be less if it was using LNG or methanol. On the fuel EU side, this starts from 2025. Both the methanol and the conventional fuel will start accumulating penalties that will have to be submitted to the European Union. Only the selection of LNG would actually give a penalty-free life to the vessel until 2035. Again, I highlight the fact that these calculations are based on a life cycle approach, with methanol being here gray. If methanol was actually green, or it was produced from renewable energy sources, then the impact would be zero, and therefore penalties would not be accumulated. A VLCC, on the VLCC side, we see this is an actual case where this particular operation was highly efficient. The life, let's say the CII life expectancy with HFO and scrubbers would go almost until the mid-30s. With LNG and methanol, we see an improved performance against CII. However, on the EU ETS, we still see that allowances in the form of euros or dollars will have to be submitted, and as you see, this submission is increasing as we move to the end of this 4-year application of the regulation in 2026, and we also have a similar impact as far as the fuel EU is concerned between the 3 different fuels. Lastly, we have the 14,000 TEU container vessel, and because this particular vessel, all those are real cases, the operation of this vessel is very challenging with regard to CII. This vessel starts its CII life with a C rating, and by the end of the decade, it will have to explore operational improvements. With LNG, it will be able to go to 2040, and with methanol, it will be able to go beyond the end of the decade. It will be able to go at the mid-30s without having to do any improvement. However, again, allowances will have to be submitted in all 3 options until 2026, and we see also a similar impact from the fuel EU side, where penalties will have to be accrued straight from the beginning of the introduction of this regulation, both on the HFO and the methanol side. Again, I highlight the fact that all those fuels are gray fuels, meaning that have a fossil fuel origin. and we have this comparison so that we can have a level playing field. If we have the carbon neutral approach, the well to wake with a renewable energy as origin, then the penalties will be zero. Thank you for your attention. I'll be glad to take your questions and looking forward for the next presentation.
Thanks, Georgios, and thanks to Mark as well for his presentation. So I'm Helen Barden. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm a solicitor in North's FD&D team and part of the Navigating Decarbonisation group, and we are starting to get a number of inquiries from members in terms of the upcoming decarbonisation related regulations, and the CII regulations, I would say, are probably the regulations causing the most concern. So before turning to the carbon intensity regulations and Charter Party considerations in that regard, I will briefly touch upon the IMO Maritime Research Fund, the IMRF, which has been mentioned, and the market-based measure of a proposed greenhouse gas levy, but which have been kicked down the road to the next year's MEPC meeting for further discussion. In terms of the IMRF proposal to be funded by collecting $2 per tonne of marine fuel consumed to raise the $5 billion fund for research and development, assuming this does ultimately get approval, then it will depend upon the point at which the $2 cost is applied and to which party, as to whether a Charter Party clause will be necessary to allocate liability elsewhere. Similarly, with a greenhouse gas levy or emission trading system, if such global market-based measures get approval, it will depend on how a levy or ETS is to be regulated and who will be primarily responsible as to whether a contractual provision will be needed to reallocate that cost. There is no clear agreement yet on which global market-based measures will be preferred or whether it will be a combination of the measures. The Marshall and Solomon Islands have proposed a carbon levy of $100 per tonne of CO2, and Norway has proposed an emission trading system combined with a fuel greenhouse gas intensity limit. The International Chamber of Shipping and Intercargo have put forward a proposal as to how a global levy-based MBM could be regulated and work. In that ICS Intercargo proposal, a contribution is made to the IMO Climate Fund, the ICF. However, if such proposal does get approval, how any final regulation is going to be drafted remains to be seen. And as I've mentioned, it's going to depend upon who has primary responsibility for compliance as to whether any contractual provisions will be needed to pass that liability or the cost of compliance onto another party. And indeed, in that proposal, the ICS makes the point that in order to work within the enforceable legal framework of the MARPOL Convention, payment of the levy would need to be made on behalf of the ship. Nevertheless, the cost of the levy needs to be recovered from the entity that assumes the commercial operation of a ship, usually under a contractual agreement such as a Charter Party contract, and is responsible thereby for purchasing and paying for the cost of the marine fuel. This needs to be made clear with any regulatory framework which is adopted for a global MBM. So if such a proposal does get the go-ahead, it does seem likely that a contractual clause would ultimately be needed in a Charter Party to ensure that the ship owner has the right to recover. Oh, are we having problems with Mark? Can you just confirm that whether the screen's frozen?
Which screen are you showing? Is it you're still on the IMO Research Fund and Decisions Weighted screen, aren't you? So yeah, I think it's fine.
Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, just finishing up on this slide. Obviously, if any proposal does get approval, then how those regulations are drafted will depend upon whether there's going to need to be contractual provisions to deal with this in due course. But given that things have been kicked down the road, it does seem that we're some time away from requiring those charter party provisions. So moving on to the CII and the charter party implications and considerations. So these will obviously arise as a result of the need to change the way in which the vessel is going to be operated. And as has already been highlighted by Georgios with his slides, some vessels will require improvement from the start to obtain an acceptable CII rating of C, and a high percentage of vessels will require an operational change or improvement by 2030 to stay within A, B or C ratings. So for vessels where operational changes need to be made to be rated C for the following year, operational changes such as speed optimization or reducing long stays may assist. Also, Georgios has highlighted in some cases operational changes like speed optimization may need to be combined with energy efficiency technologies in order to achieve or maintain a C rating, and indeed even bolder steps may be needed to achieve an A or B rating. Of course, it's not commercial to just keep dropping the speed to achieve a required CII. However, for the purpose of this talk, I'll focus on the friction that could exist between the owners and the charterers when it comes to operational changes to the vessel to meet the CII requirements. Charterers obviously want to be able to operate the ship in a manner that suits them best. So as soon as we're looking at restricting how a vessel can be operated, then it's going to affect the rights and obligations within charter parties. However, while the primary obligation for compliance under the regulation is on the owners, it is abundantly clear that charterers' cooperation will be required if owners are going to comply with the CII regulations, given that it's the charterers who have control of the vessel's employment. Another way of putting this is that both parties will likely need to succeed in some elements of the CII tug of war if the ship is going to be traded commercially, but also owners are going to be able to comply with the CII regulations. And our very clever digital team have put together this slide to help illustrate this, where we can see that owners are pulling one way in terms of the ship's operation, and which will improve the vessel's carbon intensity for the purpose of the CII regulations. But the way in which the charterers may want to trade the vessel could ultimately mean it pulls away from an improved carbon intensity for the purpose of the CII regulations. So there are obviously some actions which could help owners to meet their required annual operational CII. However, you'll also see that there are some matters that are going to require charterers' cooperation, such as less time at anchor, etc., and others that will potentially cut across charterers' use of the vessel, such as going at a slower speed. Of course, matters such as voyage optimization are in both parties' interests, but may require a departure from traditional voyage planning based on, for example, traditional weather routing to use the quickest route as opposed to routing that takes the most fuel-efficient route. And there are always operational matters that are going to be outside of either party's control, such as weather conditions. So you'll see that the way in which charterers may want to trade the vessel could impact upon the operational efficiencies that owners want to take in order to comply with the CII regulations. And on the point of compliance, there's an implicit understanding in the regulations that this means achieving a CII rating of C, albeit the regulations don't really use the sort of compliance, non-compliance terminology, but rather a required annual operational CII, which will result in a rating of C. That said, to get a D rating for a year isn't exactly non-compliance, as it doesn't immediately invoke sanctions, other than the requirement where a ship is rated D for 3 consecutive years to put in place and get approved a corrective action plan and the CM updated accordingly. So in this regard, determining how the CII should be dealt with in the charter party is far from straightforward. Whether a requirement to maintain a CII rating of C should be the yardstick, or a requirement to not exceed the required annual operational CII for the year on a pro rata basis should be the yardstick for compliance, or indeed an obligation to redeliver with a particular rating is something for discussion. Another point for consideration in a charter party may be whether the owners should have the right to refuse orders, which could stop the vessel achieving the required annual operational CII, or would mean dropping below a C rating for the following year. However, such a right may need to recognise that it's possible for an order to be given by charterers which is poor for CII purposes, but could be offset by a later order given by charterers which is more operationally efficient. What is clear is that collaboration and transparency of emissions data will be required on a continual basis so that owners can understand the impact of the operation and their orders on the vessel CII, and if necessary, understand better the possible need for corrective actions. Another key point that just needs to be borne in mind is that the rating a ship has at any given time from 2024 onwards is the rating of the previous year, and is not reflective of how the ship is trading or performing that current year. So we understand that some charterers may, as part of their environmental and sustainability goals, seek to charter ships of only A or B or A to C ratings, even though how a ship is rated at the time of delivery will not reflect how the ship is actually operating up to that point in the current year. Also, whether differences in hire rates between different rated ships emerge remains to be seen. I just want to flag that BIMCO are currently working on a clause for CII, and I'm on the drafting committee for that clause. Obviously, due to the complexities with how the regulations are drafted and how to determine compliance from a charterer's perspective, and also the commercial positions of both owners and charterers, it's not an easy clause to draft, but it is understood that there is obviously industry pressure to get such a clause out as soon as possible, so we are working on that. And finally, I just wanted to mention, I spoke in our webinar in June about some example BIMCO clauses that do deal with operational efficiencies, such as the just-in-time clause for voyage charter parties and the BIMCO slow steaming clause. So I won't repeat any of those here, but obviously there is a recording of that webinar available for anybody who missed it. And now I will pass back over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That was great. And thank you, Georges, as well. All very enlightening. Before I was going to ask Georges a couple of questions, just throw questions out to the room before our Q&A about carbon capture technology and wind-assisted power. But before I do that, there's a question come in here I just want to answer, and it's about the how are other nations looking at CII, etc., compared to the EU. Now, my understanding is the CII, the carbon intensity indicator, is a global measure. Effectively, it's a global measure, and that affects the whole of the world, effectively, and any states which are signatories to the IMO conventions, therefore. So that will have an impact on everywhere that is a signatory to it. However, the EU ETS, the EU emission trading system, and any other emission trading systems such as in America or China or anywhere else in the world will be over and above that. And then just to complicate matters even further, then we may have a global levy as well, as we discussed at the start of this presentation. So it really is going to be a complicated footprint as we go forward here, and that's really where we need to see more clarity. So hopefully that'll answer that question. I see there's another question here coming in now for Helen. Please, means she want a friend. We have so many times. Okay, that's something we can discuss later. Okay, just on to the next part of the presentation, and I'm just going to quickly start. If we've got any more questions, please put them into the chat. But just while we're waiting for the next part of the presentation, I'm just going to start by just basically asking Georgios, we've looked at a couple of things lately, and if we could all, I'm going to take the presentation off the screen now, and if we could all, Georgios and Helen and David could just put the cameras on, please. I mean, Georgios, what's your thoughts on carbon capture technology and wind-assisted power, for example? How do you see that developing as we go through this next period? And how are ABS dealing with this? And if anybody else has anything, Helen, contractually or David or anything, then please feel free to add. It's just a question I want to put out there.
Thanks, Mark. Both of them are quite big topics. Now, let's take it one by one. Carbon capture. So first of all, if you look at carbon capture from a technology point of view, All the reports that we have seen and the reports that have been submitted also in the United Nations in COP show that carbon capture would be required in order to support the transition as we move from the conventional power and fuels to green carbon neutral ones. So carbon capture is going to be utilized heavily ashore. We see that there is a huge growth on that part. Now, what happens on board? There are currently, and over the last couple of years, quite a few initiatives looking at how this technology can be integrated on board. It is a very interesting solution. I will start, as always, since we are representing a classification society, from the regulatory part and the certification part. The framework that could actually framework to be used in order for carbon capture to be introduced in the calculations of any carbon intensity alignment, both on the IMO or the regional regulatory side, does not exist so far. Carbon capture on board, was discussed during the intersessional working groups in MEPC over the beginning of this year. However, it was deemed as a technology not mature, and therefore the discussion and the dialogue around the introduction of carbon capture on board in the regulatory framework was deemed at that point premature. I'm very confident that this will come up again in the next MEPCs. However, this is where it stands right now from a regulatory side. As far as technology is concerned, there are developments that are being done. ABS is involved in a number of projects looking at how this can be integrated. And we're looking at VLCC designs, we're looking at LNG carrier designs. There are a couple of different technologies that can be introduced on ships. However, they have operational challenges that need to be considered with regards to how you manage the system on board, how you replenish the reactants, how you it's a system that needs to be introduced very, very carefully in your PMS, more or less. It will require very good planning. Wind-assisted propulsion is a completely different animal. It is part of the 3 energy efficiency technology categories already introduced by IMO and the guidelines. So we can consider that. Depending on what type of technology you use, it is either a net power saving provider or a power saving provider without the requirement to have power consumed on board. There are also now the correspondence groups and the intersessional working groups are working on the mechanisms to be used in order to verify wind-assisted propulsion, so that the impact that they're going to have on the power saving and therefore carbon intensity reduction can be actually calculated from the regulatory framework point of view. But this, as far as the wind-assisted propulsion is concerned, this is moving very, very fast at this point in time.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Georgia. So, I mean, just the one thing, I don't have much to add on the wind-assisted propulsion, but the bit of research we've done on carbon capture systems shows that the EU ETS actually credit for this, but that's obviously based on the shoreside system. So perhaps we may see that creeping into the shipping side of it, but also as well, there's going to be a bit of a demand for it, and because it's the carbon capture can actually be used to assist with oil production and the oil wells as well. So it's more suited to certain types of vessels as well. But
it's definitely growing. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Is there anything anybody else has got to add before we close this off now? Because I think we're over the hour now. So there's a question here from John Pierre Lisman just come in there. How can tankers improve the CI? Yeah, I'll leave that one with you, George. I think that'll be better. Can you see that question okay, George? Yeah.
Very good points. And these are the exclusions and reduction and corrective factors that we expect that these are going to be developed in the guidelines to be published in the next months. Unfortunately, we had no resolution on that. This is a very good point that was actually raised on how the particularities of the different operations can be incorporated in the calculation so that we can have a level playing field. The other thing that also it's related to tankers, there is also a very specific segment that is also heavily impacted without having certain exclusions that would provide this level playing field. These are shuttle tankers. Shuttle tankers also have a very particular operating profile, and that is now, as far as the CII is concerned, as it is, it works against them. It's not providing any clarity on how we can actually create this level playing field.
Thanks, Georgios. Thanks. So, just from my understanding as well, this so that's really the correction factors which are going to be feeding into this, really, isn't it? And that's what's hopefully we're going to see more clarity by MEPC 78 on the correction factors, because we know there's a working group working hard in the background now to try and come up with some answers on this.
Correction factors and exclusions.
Yeah,
there are going to be some during the correspondence groups.
Excellent. Okay. All right, well, I think we're just over on time now. I don't think there's any more. Oh, we've got another question flying in there now. I think that's probably one. Is that one, Helen? Would you like to pick up on that one? Sorry to push it in your direction, Helen, but I think you're best placed to answer that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, when it comes to bareboat charter parties, in terms of the way in which the vessels operating or trading will rest with the bareboat charterer, the owners will obviously give the ship to the bareboat charterer, and then the bareboat charterer will be dealing with the trade of that ship, whether by way of letting out on time charter. So it's an operational issue. So we'll sit with the bareboat charterer really, rather than with the owners.
Okay, thank you, Helen. It's great. So I think that's it. I think that's all the questions now. As we've said, we've run a little bit over there, but not too much, so it's not too bad. If there's any other questions afterwards, we'll send over anybody who's registered for this event. We'll get a copy of the presentation. They'll get a copy of the video as well. And within that will be Georgios, David, Helen, and my email addresses. So please feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Look out for our next webinar. We'll be doing one next year sometime. We'll give some more news on that as and when it comes to light. Please feel free to contact us, and I hope everybody has an enjoyable day ahead. And thank you very much for your time. More than anything, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.